Hello and welcome to this month's episode of Maybe's Eye. I'm Fiona McGregor and I'm here with my co-host Marlene Halliday from the Indie Life podcast team. This month we're going to be looking at one of the key topics from the 2014 referendum, and that is pensions. What happens after independence?
We've got a really good presentation by Tim Rideout of the Scottish Currency Group. It was a meeting that was held, so there's some questions, and I think they find this really useful.
Now, if we were going to be asked to guess what the top 3 issues are going to be in the campaign to come, I'm pretty sure pensions would be up there.
Yes, indeed, because we know from back in 2014, understandably, people had concerns and worries, fears about their pensions. Would they still get it? What would happen to it? And we also know, 2014, that the No campaign played on those fears. They really kind of went to town with them. So there are a few other examples where that happened as well. I mean, here we are. We know the Scottish Government are taking forward their push for a referendum at the end of next year. Fingers crossed for that. But it's clear that there are some topics that will be in the forefront of the campaign. They'll be put in the forefront of the campaign by the No, the unionist side. We've got to be prepared to kind of meet those head on. Pensions is one of them. And I think this talk is not the final answer, but it's got such a lot of good information in it, and it's presented really straightforwardly by Tim. There was a bit of polling going on in it, and Tim asked people in the audience to say, did they have a state pension just now? Did they maybe have, private pensions?
It was very interesting just how many categories there are. They included people who are public sector workers, state pensioners in Scotland, people who move between England and Scotland with
armed forces. Yeah,
we've got the Scottish devolved civil service, the UK government civil service, which are things like DWP and Inland Revenue, which are a lot of people in Scotland employed in that, and also private pensions, and whether it's a self-invested pension, whether you worked for a company or in Scotland or abroad. The other thing that's fascinating is just listening as the questioning kind of shows how people's thinking transforms through the course of the discussion from, well, that's not fair, to, oh yeah, I see the logic of that. And I think it's a really important campaigning point to have clear in our minds. In fact, it's probably the most important campaigning point for that question.
There's a lot of people who think that the state pension is a legal contract between you and the government, and that the state is required to pay your pension. And in fact, that's not the case. This isn't a contract. It's what's known as an entitlement. So an entitlement is something where the state agrees to pay you something in return for something that you have done, paying your taxes, for example, or in this case, paying national insurance. But it's an entitlement, which means the state can withdraw that entitlement if it wishes to, or it can amend the entitlement. So unemployment benefit, for example, is another entitlement. Statutory sick pay is an entitlement. All that the government would have to do to change your entitlement is to pass legislation in Parliament at Westminster. They have done that multiple times. The WASPy women, for example, lost out on 5 years' worth of pension because the government changed the law. And the state pension age has been raised twice and is going to be raised again in the future. So those are all changes to your entitlement that are made without your agreement. So it isn't a legal contract. As pensions became a hot topic in the last few weeks, then there were a lot of people saying that the UK would have to pay the pension after independence. But that isn't the legal position. They can change the law and exclude us if they wanted to do so. The state pension is a critical issue. There's 980,000 people receiving the state pension in Scotland at the moment. And obviously all the rest of us think we're going to get it, or most of the rest of us think we're going to get it in the future. The people in receipt of the state pension is about 25% of the voters. So if we upset them somehow over pensions, then that probably results in us losing the independence referendum. The only sensible option for the UK state pension is to say unequivocally that the Scottish Government will take over the state pension from Independence Day and will start paying it in full with whatever people are entitled to at that point. And obviously, if you're already getting the pension, they'll just carry on paying that pension. Anything else as a proposition for the referendum, saying that we think, if you go down the route Ian Blackford went down of saying that he thinks London should pay, that introduces a question mark. Because London, the no side, all they have to do is say, we won't pay. And now you've got a question mark in the minds of pensioners, am I going to get my pension or will I not get the pension if I vote for independence? And you really can't afford to do that. So I think any argument about should the UK pay or should it not pay in advance of a referendum is a losing strategy, because it gives the ball to the no campaign. It allows them to raise a doubt in people's minds about, is there going to be a state pension or isn't there going to be a state pension? If we look at the practicalities of the state pension, there is no fund, there's no investments, there's no assets. The National Insurance Fund is a bit of a contract, because all that happens is that the National Insurance is collected each month, paid into an account at the Bank of England called the National Insurance Fund, and the pensions are paid out of it. And as a result, the balance in the fund in that account is usually never more than about 20 billion, which is around 2 months' worth of payments. It has actually been in surplus in the past, but that doesn't remain the case for very long, because the Chancellor just helps himself to any surplus and transfers it to the Consolidated Fund for General Expenditure. So in terms of that national insurance, if we look at the JERS figures, which the unionists love, and are deliberately using their data because then they can't argue with it, the estimate is that national insurance in Scotland in 2020 was, what was paid in by us was £11.5 billion, and the cost of the state pension in Scotland was £8.5 billion. And the other money went on things like statutory sick pay, statutory redundancy pay, and maternity pay and paternity pay. But that was only £2.5 billion. So there was actually 500 million or so left over out of the national insurance that we paid. So it's perfectly clear as a result that even using the JERS figures, that the Scottish Government is well able to pay the state pension, as of Independence Day. So there's no reason to have any argument about it. There's no question that we have enough money to pay the pension. I mean, I don't like that narrative anyway, because the state always has the money to pay what it wishes to pay. We can just do it. And it's not difficult, because the only two things that we need in order to take over the state pension is the Department of Work and Pensions database on how many years entitlement you've built up. So do you have the full 35 years or not? We need a list of the pensions in payment and the bank account details for who they're going to. And we need to know who is legally domiciled in Scotland on Independence Day. So that's whether you're living here or not. So it's just 2 bits of information we need, and then we can just take it over. I would rename it and call it the Scottish Universal Pension going forward. Now, what happens after Independence Day? Well, anyone who, for example, moves from England to Scotland after independence, they would be in the position of somebody who moves to Spain. So they're then going to continue getting their pension paid by the UK government in the same way as they would pay the pension of someone who went to Spain or Portugal or elsewhere. In the reverse direction, if somebody from Scotland decides to move south of the border after independence, the same situation would apply, in that the Scottish Government would be liable for paying their pension if they've moved abroad. And that would apply whether you'd went to Canada, England, Australia, or anywhere else. If you change job and you have, say, 10 years contributions to the Scottish State Pension Scheme, and then you move to England and you build up 25 years of contributions to the English state pension, then you'd get some money from both schemes. It would be perfectly possible for the Scottish Government and the UK Government to put in place some sort of mechanism similar to what exists between the Republic of Ireland and the UK, which would allow people to transfer their pension entitlement from one country to the other one. But that's not guaranteed. It doesn't have to happen. The state pension is really a bit of a non-issue because we'll just take it over, quite simple, very little admin, and we'll just pay it going forward. And it's already the SNP's policy to try to increase that pension to the European average, which would be about £300 per week per person, as soon as possible after independence. Probably not in one big jump, but above inflation increases each year until we get it up to the EU average.
Is that a pan-European scheme that we would join, or are you talking about just a unilateral UK-Scotland?
I think it's probably on the basis of individual state to individual state, but we can use the agreement with Ireland as a template to build on. Obviously, it's not terribly effective or efficient for people to have a few years pension from half a dozen different countries. It'd be better probably to consolidate it into one pension from one country. But that's something that would have to be negotiated between.
The option would be either we could have our own system negotiated with the UK, or depending on where we go in terms of EU membership, we could apply a European system.
Yes, well, I think if there is an EU system for transferring pensions, then we would obviously join if we're in EFTA or whether we're in the EU. But we'd have to negotiate a specific deal with the UK since they're not in the EU anymore. And that could be similar to the EU template or the Irish template.
Yes, I'm an EU citizen living in Scotland. I have a small pension from Denmark, and that just gets paid out now that I'm in receipt of state pension here. So there's not been any problems with that, even though we have left the EU. But some people that live in Scotland consider themselves English. Would they then get paid from the UK or from Scotland?
No, the citizenship has nothing to do with pensions. It's all about your contribution record. Polish plumber working in the UK and paying national insurance builds up a record of number of years contributed. If they get to 10 years, then they're entitled to a UK pension even after they move back to Poland. Somebody who is English, if they are living in Scotland on Independence Day, they would be switched to the Scottish state pension. If they move to Scotland after Independence Day, then they would get whatever entitlement they have under the English scheme. If they work in Scotland and they build up a sufficient contribution record to the Scottish pension scheme, then they would also get a Scottish pension. Well, not a full one, but they'd get however much they were entitled to.
Yeah, but we are all paying in a UK pension scheme at the moment.
Yes, but you will, as of Independence Day, you would leave the UK scheme if you're resident in Scotland, yes.
But what if you don't want to leave the UK?
I don't think you're going to have a choice. You'd have to move south of the border.
At the moment, there are pensioners living in Canada and Australia who are living in penury because their pensions were stopped at a certain level the moment they left Britain to go to wherever it is. There are pensioners in Canada existing on £30 a week and stuff like this. How would that work with the Scottish pensions?
Well, that was an improvement made by Mrs. Thatcher in 1981, which was vindictive and spiteful, if you ask me. It's very unfair because some countries you get the annual inflation increase and other countries you don't. There's no justification whatsoever for saying, like my mother in South Africa, that she doesn't get an increase because, I don't know, for some reason the UK doesn't like South Africa. Whereas if she was in Portugal, she would get an increase. I would be very surprised if the Scottish government distinguished between Scots abroad and those in Scotland. They would all get the same annual increase.
Could you just, for my benefit, quickly run through what happened in Ireland and is there a special case for them with the state pensions?
There's just a reciprocal agreement that if an Irish national moves to the UK, they can transfer their pension entitlement out of the Irish scheme and into the UK scheme and vice versa.
Right.
You can do that with the Isle of Man as well, which is, I'm from the Isle of Man.
They would get the pension based on what they've paid into insurance in Ireland. They'd still get it here.
Yes, but it would be paid at the UK rate.
Gov.uk states clearly that state pension is still payable if you live abroad. Why would people in Scotland be treated differently from those in any other country outside our UK?
Yeah, well, this is the argument that some people put forward and which Ian Blackford was putting forward. Anyone who thinks that the UK would carry on paying the pensions for the next 40 years for 5.5 million people in Scotland after we've chosen to become independent. That's a dream world. It's just not going to happen. There's a moral argument that says that they took the national insurance contributions and therefore they should pay the money. But in the sort of realpolitik, they just aren't going to do that. There isn't an investment fund. There's no, your national insurance contributions from this year have been spent this year on other people's pensions. And I think there's a fairness element to it as well, in that the national insurance that we pay in is immediately paid out to those who are getting a pension at the moment. When Scotland becomes independent, we will take over the tax, so the national insurance, we'll get the 11.5 billion that's paid in, and we can well afford then to pay out the pensions for the people in Scotland. It would be particularly perverse for us to say that we're going to take the tax revenue of the national insurance, but you can pay the pension. I don't think that's a very productive argument. And more importantly, you need to think about this here. The key issue is the case in the independence referendum. So if you're going to say that, well, the UK should pay the state pension after independence, and they're going to say, no, we won't, now you've raised a doubt. And everyone receiving the state pension, all 980,000 of them, plus the rest of us who think we're going to get it in the future, you've now allowed the no side to raise a doubt about whether we are or are not going to get a pension. And that way you just lose the referendum. So it's a stupid argument to get into, regardless of any sort of morality around it.
But if you take the example of supposing someone lived in Scotland all their life and worked 30 years before independence and then 10 years after independence, they would have 30 years of entitlement under the UK pension system and then 10 years of entitlement under the Scottish system. And it's possible that the UK government might want to appoint the new Scottish Department of Work and Pensions to actually handle those payments. But the obligation for the first 30 years clearly still rests with the UK government. It would mean treating people in Scotland different from people in Spain.
Well, yes, we are going to be treated differently to people in Spain because we as a country are opting out of the UK. The people in Spain, there might be individuals who've gone to live in Spain, but Spain was never part of the UK. If there was a big pot of money sitting somewhere that was the national investment fund like Norway has, the situation would be very different and you'd be able to claim 8% of the fund, but there isn't a fund. What you're saying is that future taxpayers in England would have to pay pensions from people who have chosen to become part of an independent country. As I say, it's just not going to happen. And you've still got the issue there that you're going to have a big fight about it in the future. That's going to be played on in the independence campaign and for the referendum. What are you doing about the pension? Oh, well, England's going to have to pay. No, they won't. Yes, you will. No, we're not going to. We're absolutely not going to. And it's just a vote loser. So I wouldn't go there. We can perfectly well just take over in your case there with somebody who has 30 years entitlement in the UK scheme, that will just transfer into the Scottish scheme. They add another 10 years and they get a full Scottish state pension when they retire. So very straightforward and easy.
It should be really obvious by now that the currency issuer controls what happens politically, and that's really seen with the withdrawal of Test just now. So, I really look forward to the day when, Scotland is the currency issuer and I'm taking home my pension in the Scottish currency. I'm looking forward to that day, and I would hope everyone else here who wants independence does look forward to that day too.
Well, I think more of an issue, in fact, is I'm suggesting that there probably has to be some sort of qualification period for maybe, say, a year before independence, that you have to be resident in Scotland for that year to then transfer into the Scottish state pension and qualify for the Scottish pension. Because otherwise, you could have a rush of people from down south moving to Scotland for a few weeks around independence on the basis that the Scottish government's going to put the state pension up, and that way they'll be able to claim the Scottish pension at a higher rate than the UK one if they'd stayed put. So you don't want that sort of benefit tourism. I think it's quite clear that the Scottish government is going to raise the state pension above the UK level. So there's no reason for anyone to be hesitant about shifting from the UK scheme into the new Scottish one. The Isle of Man pays a state pension that is significantly higher than the UK one, so does the Republic of Ireland. we can do quite a lot to reduce pensioner poverty going forward.
I've always been firmly of the opinion that I paid all these contributions into the UK and they should damn well pay my pension. But I think the big problem with that, it becomes similar to NDRF when Alex Hammond said there will be a currency union, and the UK said, no, there won't. That just became a brick wall that it kept bumping up against. Pensions would be the same in NDRF too. And I think the statement, just the way you made it, Scotland takes ownership of the taxes, our national insurance already covers all our pensions. Pensions would be maintained from day one of independence by the Scottish Government. It's clean and it doesn't allow Westminster to say no. So I think this is actually a benefit to the campaign as well as obviously to the individuals going forward.
Absolutely correct. And I think there is a quid pro quo because in the negotiations, I would say to London, right, well, we're relieving you of the liability of the state pension, so saving you £8.5 billion a year on that, and therefore you can take your national debt and shove it because we're not contributing. So it's not a case that they're sort of getting away with something. It's inevitable that we would take over the pension, and we can use it as a bargaining chip to tell them that the Growth Commission idea that we pay £5 billion a year towards the UK debt is just nonsense.
Why on earth isn't the Scottish Government and the SNP saying the same thing?
I think there's been insufficient thought. There's plenty of people who can, like me, who can tell them what the sensible policy is, and the leadership just have to listen because these questions they're not difficult. As with pensions, for every one of these issues, we have to make sure that we do not give the advantage to the no side. So that the same thing applies with currency. That your only sensible option, the one which can't be challenged, is that we will have our own currency as soon as possible, which fortunately is actually SNP policy, despite what Andrew Wilson might say from time to time. There are approximately 260,000 people in the local government pension schemes, and there's about 585,000 employed in the public sector, most of whom will have a public sector pension. So that's 22% of the working population are employed in the public sector, and it's interesting that we've got about 35% of the audience who have some sort of public sector pension. Obviously, some people move between the private sector and the public sector, so the number of people with a public sector pension is going to be bigger than those currently employed in the public sector. Some people have a UK government pension. So that would be if you work for a central government department, so something like HMRC, Department of Work and Pensions, those sort of things. There's people who've been in the services would get an armed forces pension. And then we've got a reasonable percentage having a private sector final salary scheme, which these days most of those are now closed. So there's a cohort of people, mostly over 50, who do have a final salary pension in the private sector, and then anyone under about 50 doesn't. And they've been pushed into money purchase schemes where what you get depends on the investment return. Obviously, we've got some people who have personal pension, and we've got some who already have cashed that in for an annuity because they're retired. And there's a few people who are just intending to use savings. So the Scottish public sector pension plans are already paid by the Scottish Government. Some of them are funds like the local authorities, the Strathclyde Pension Fund, for example. The local authority schemes altogether have something like 50 billion of assets, which pays the pensions. A lot of the other public sector pensions in Scotland, for example, the Scottish Health Service, they're unfunded. The Scottish Government just provides the funding each year to pay those pensions. So for all of the public sector, the Scottish public sector schemes, all those nearly 600,000 people working in them, plus those who are retired, the Scottish Government deals with them already. So there's nothing to take over. It's already done through Holyrood. And all that will happen is that they will start to be paid in the new Scottish pound. You're not going to get a choice about that. It will be paid in Scottish pounds whether you like it or not. In terms of UK government, central government employees or retired employees, then those are a liability of the UK. If you used to work for the Foreign Office, or you still work for the Foreign Office, or Department of Work and Pensions, or something like that, then up and whatever your entitlement or your legal contract says up until the date of independence, in terms of what you're going to get or what you are getting or what you're going to get in the future as a pension, then that would be the responsibility of Westminster. The possible exception to that would be if some of those staff transfer to the employment of the Scottish Government, in which case the European Union's, the TUPE rules would, I think, provide for the pension entitlement to be transferred to the new employer, and the UK would have to pay the Scottish Government the sort of liquidated cost of what that future entitlement might be. The armed forces, if you've served in the services, then again, that's a liability of the UK government, and they would have to pay that. If you are a current service person and you transfer to the Scottish Defence Force, then again, the same thing could apply, that you could transfer your pension and you could have to pay towards that into a new Scottish Armed Forces pension. All the Scottish public sector pensioners, they don't have anything to worry about. There's no question about the pensions they're going to get, or they do get at the moment. The only difference is that they change to the Scottish pound, which is sensible, because if you're living in Scotland, that's what you need to spend, and you don't want to be getting your pension in a foreign currency. For the private sector schemes, then you're still going to get your pension. It's a contract between you and the employer, but where the employer isn't based in Scotland, or at least the headquarters of the employer isn't in Scotland. So, for example, if you worked for British Airways and you're part of the British Airways pension scheme, they're headquartered in London, and you are probably going to get paid in sterling, because that's where they're based, and that's what they'll do. There might be some bigger employers who make a special arrangement that people can ask for their pension to be paid in Scottish pounds instead. But I think that probably is going to be the exception to the rule. A foreign headquartered company, well, that's probably maybe going to be a little bit different in that they're foreign anyway, so they'll be having to convert from their own currency into sterling to pay you, so they might as well convert into Scottish pounds and pay you in Scottish pounds going forward. A private pension, and we've got a number of people who have some sort of private pension, going to depend a bit on where the pension provider is based. So if it's a Scottish pension provider, they should be able to set up the option to have your pension paid in Scottish pounds if you wish. Although I guess you would have the choice, so you could choose to keep it in sterling or have it paid in Scottish pounds. If it's an English provider like Aviva, it's uncertain as to whether they would provide you with the option of having the pension converted into Scottish pounds or not. I suspect it's going to stay in sterling, and if you wanted to remove any exchange rate risk, then you could probably transfer your pension fund to a Scottish provider instead. There are some people who do their own investing in a personal pension, and the fund in that case, because the stock market is in London, all the investments are quoted in sterling. That is going to stay in sterling. So at the point when you retire, your fund would be sterling, and you would have the option of converting it into Scottish pounds and buying an annuity or drawdown pension in Scotland, or keeping it in sterling.
The public sector pension schemes, which are described as unfunded, which includes the NHS staff, teachers, firefighters, police, and the devolved section of the civil service pensions, they're unfunded, but unfunded means that there isn't an investment fund. The contributions aren't paid into an investment fund. It's a pay-as-you-go pension, similar to where the state pension is a pay-as-you-go system. But the members of those schemes all pay contributions, and the benefits paid by those schemes are paid out to the contribution income.
The difference between that and the state pension, of course, is that it's a contract between you and your employer. So it's a legally binding agreement that you get the pension in the way that the state pension isn't. So the Scottish Government is required to pay you, regardless of whether independence happens or not. And what you're going to get is very clearly defined. And if you didn't get it, you'd be able to sue them and you'd win. I can see Gareth has put a question in here that's about public sector pensions, so the teachers' pensions and so on. But I don't think that the government can just, for example, halve teachers' pensions by passing legislation to do so, because it's an employer-employee contract. So they could change what the entitlements would be going forward in the future, but they can't change what's happened in the past. So that's an argument at the moment in the university superannuation scheme, that the employers want to reduce what you accrue from now on, but they can't take away what you've already got.
Most of the rules in the teachers' pension scheme are a statutory instrument, which does get changed from time to time. So, for example, just this year, they changed the rules so that instead of paying a full inflationary increase linked to the various baskets, it was the inflation increase was limited to 3.1% as per the state pension. So I don't think they'd ever do anything stupid to remove all the past entitlement, because that would be incredibly controversial. But in principle, the rules do get changed from time to time.
They could change something like an inflation increase, but if you've built up 30 years service and you've got another 5 years to go, or 10 years or something like that, I don't think that they can say that they're going to unilaterally reduce what you got from the 30 years you already built up.
It's been pretty standard practice over many years for employer-sponsored pension schemes and defined benefit pension schemes like the one I'm involved in, to change the benefit rules and the accrual rules from time to time. One of the most common ones is the changing the rules from a final salary defined pension to what they call a career average. So these changes happen all the time in pension schemes. It's nothing new.
No, but in the case of my wife, for example, in USS, then she's got what she had up until a few years ago, which is in the final salary part, and then since they made the change, she's got another bit which is in a career average part of the scheme. So she didn't lose her final salary bit; she just stopped being able to add to it. There are quite a few people here who do have some sort of UK government bonds or national savings certificates, premium bonds, things like that. I think I have £2 worth of premium bonds somewhere. There are quite a few of you who would, and maybe not surprising since you're all probably independent supporters, who would cash in your UK government savings and transfer them into Scottish government equivalents. So that's quite good, because that's a benefit for the new currency. And obviously, if you do keep investments in sterling, then you're now going to have an exchange rate risk going forward. So you might gain, you might lose, depending on whether the Scottish pound stays the same, goes up or goes down against sterling. Personally, I suspect it's going to gradually increase slightly against sterling, but that's basically because of the mismanagement of the UK economy and its long-term decline. Might be interested that, for example, in 1947, you got 25 Swiss francs to the pound, and today it's about 1 to 1. So, sterling going down is not, it's a long-term 100-year trend, and I suspect that will likely continue. Some people would keep a little bit in the UK and switch the rest. And in terms of cash, well, I think most of you would just change whatever cash you've got into the Scottish pound. Obviously, it's a self-selecting audience, doesn't mean that much in terms of a genuine opinion poll, but it's a straw in the wind, I think, that when people say that the new currency would not be popular and therefore we have to use sterling and stuff like that, that they're probably wrong. So we've fairly comprehensively, I think, covered the state pension, which is the one that's going to affect everybody. There are a lot of people who don't have anything other than the state pension, but for those in the public sector, then you really don't have an issue. For most public sector people, the Scottish Government's going to carry on paying your pension as they do at the moment. And there's a few people who used to work, or who will have used to work for the UK, where the UK would be paying their pension. And in terms of private sector, it's a little bit more complicated, because it depends largely where your employer is and whether they're going to carry on paying you in sterling, or whether they would agree to switch it into the Scottish pound if you wanted to do that. But I think for a lot of people, they're probably going to get sterling. They're inevitably going to have some exchange rate risk. For people with private pensions and investments, If they wish to remove that exchange rate risk, they would be able to switch their cash into the Scottish pound. If they have national savings and gilts and bonds, things like that, they can switch that into Scottish equivalents, remove the exchange rate risk. If you're investing in stocks and shares, then the market is in London and your funds are going to stay in sterling. There's absolutely no point whatsoever in trying to convert a stocks and shares ISA into Scottish pound, because all the investments are in London and your trading funds would need to stay in sterling, because otherwise you'd be paying foreign exchange charges every time you bought and sold something. Okay, we've got any more questions? Well, there's one here in the chat about a stock exchange, and obviously at the moment, there were plans from Michelle Thompson and another business partner to try and set up a stock exchange a few years ago, which unfortunately didn't go anywhere. But I think becoming independent and introducing our own currency makes it much easier and more likely that we will get a stock exchange in Scotland, because it removes a lot of the competition from London, and it would then provide a means for either our companies or companies which operate in Scotland, such as Diageo, to have a local quotation. So a lot of companies, especially bigger ones, have quotes on lots of different stock exchanges. You don't have to restrict yourself to just one stock exchange. So Diageo could have a quote on the London Stock Exchange, and they could have a quote in Scottish pounds on the Scottish Stock Exchange. So that way you could then, going forward, you'd be able to build up a portfolio of shares that were quoted in Scottish pounds and valued in Scottish pounds. We have a question in the chat that I've just seen here, which is asking about SWIFT. SWIFT is just the international interbank payments system. If you make international payments, you're already using SWIFT. That would be used going forward for payments between Scotland and England. So if you were trying to pay a supplier in England, that would be an international payment, and you'd set it up via, you wouldn't really notice what was happening, but you would just ask your bank to make an international payment, and that you would get a small fee for it, but it would go through via the SWIFT network.
What would happen at the moment of independence? Would everybody who is in Scotland at that time and who was entitled to a pension, would they then qualify immediately? And what happens thereafter to people moving either into Scotland from the rest of the UK, and or people from Scotland moving towards the rest of the UK? Where does their pensions switch over?
What we need to establish is who is legally domiciled in Scotland as of Independence Day. So obviously anyone who is designated as a Scottish taxpayer, if you look at your HMRC tax code and it's got an S in it, then you're a Scottish taxpayer, which means the HMRC consider you legally domiciled in Scotland. So all of those people would obviously transfer have their national insurance records transferred into the Scottish state pension. For everyone else, then we'd have to look at your residential address. So that basically people who are not taxpayers or not registered, currently paying national insurance, or not in receipt of an existing state pension. So you'd look at the address of that person and decide whether the address was in England or Wales or Northern Ireland or Scotland. And the Scottish ones would then be transferred across. As I say, I think you should probably have to put some sort of, you have to have been resident in Scotland for a year or something like that prior to independence. Otherwise, as I say, since it would be well advertised, I think that the Scottish pension was going to be increased. You could get people who are moving just because they wanted to cash.
Of course, there's a lot of people who are in the fortunate position to have multiple houses. So could we have potentially multiple receipt of pensions?
I fully understand what you're saying, but you only have one national insurance record per person. So it's either going to stay in the UK scheme or it's going to transfer to the Scottish scheme, and you're not going to be able to end up with two national insurance records. And I think for most people, where they're legally domiciled is going to be quite clear from the tax database. So if you are paying any sort of income tax or national insurance, that is going to identify where your legal domicile is. The only argument could be about people who are not paying any sort of tax. If it wasn't clear, you'd have to designate whether you were living in Scotland or England if you've got multiple addresses.
We used to have stock exchanges in Scotland. We had one in Greenock here. Mm-hmm. Is there any way they can be set up before independence? I know, as I said,
Michelle Thompson, the MP, is very keen on getting a stock exchange up and running in Scotland, but I think it'll as soon as it's clear that we're going to become independent, it'll be a much more interesting business proposition for people, and I think it'll happen quite quickly. They all closed down because they couldn't manage with the competition from London.
But central banks, can they be set up before independence?
The Scottish Reserve Bank would be the central bank of Scotland, and the currency group has already done some basic planning for it, but we can do more of that prior to a referendum in terms of just of basic design. And the work of actually building it needs to start the day after the vote for independence. That's both in terms of getting legislation through Holyrood, but actually commissioning the IT systems and finding office premises and all of that sort of stuff.
I have looked at various articles and things about how affordable Germany's pensions are, how affordable Italy's pensions are. And there's an awful lot of evidence out there that says a lot of these countries are moving to a situation where they are actually already paying in long-term unaffordable pensions. Isn't there a danger that we are effectively, as the SNP, committing to a European level of pension that on the continent they already know they can't afford?
Well, certainly with Germany, I mean, I don't think the German pensions are unaffordable. Prior to COVID, the German government was running a budget surplus, so they could obviously easily afford to increase expenditure without any problem if they wanted to. The issue with pensions really is that it's always a sort of effectively an intergenerational transfer, and nobody ever actually saves for a pension per se, in that unless you were going to fill the garage with tins of baked beans and packets of bog roll and so on, what you're doing is relying on people working at the time when you want to be getting the pension, handing over some of their income to you. If you take the money out of the equation, if I'm retired in 2040 and I want a car, that car has to be built by people working in 2040 who then don't get the benefit of the car because I've taken it off them. The secret about all of this is that during your working life, you have to invest sufficiently that the cake is big enough after you retire to not only pay the next generation their own income, but allow some of it to go to you. So, have we built the roads and railways and hospitals and schools and factories and so forth that allow the economy to be sufficiently large going forward that it can pay the incomes of those in work, the young and the elderly? And as long as we do that, then there isn't ever going to be a problem about paying pensions. If we fail to invest, and I think the UK has an issue here where, as a country, we have rather failed to invest. If you don't grow the cake to the size necessary, then you are going to have a problem paying pensions.
Going back to the state pensions, it's certainly an area that I've struggled to get straight in my head. I got the feeling that there was a feeling of unfairness that they contributed all this years and the UK government wouldn't pay it back. So the way I've reconciled it in my head, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that while we're part of the UK, we contribute to a big pot to fund the pensioners who are receiving in receipt of the pension at the moment. And the way I thought about it is my contributions pay for Scottish pensioners. And so nothing changes when we become independent. If I'm still working, my contributions still pay for Scottish pensioners. And when I do retire, those working in Scotland will pay for my pension. So, there is no savings. We pay our national insurance with the expectation that when we retire, those who are still working will fund us. So that money is being spent in Scotland. So it's not a case of the UK government owing anything to us as regards to pensions.
Quite a good way of looking at it. But I mean, at the end of the day, the only issue about a pension is, do you get paid what you think what the agreement was that you would receive? It doesn't really matter who pays it. If you're entitled to £170 a week from the state pension, and as long as you get £170 a week, then does it matter whether that's paid by the Scottish Government or by the Westminster Government or the European Parliament or whatever? It's a bit of a sort of debating point, really. And I think the issue is that people have to have the certainty that they're going to get what they believe their entitlement is. That has to be a cast iron guarantee, and the only one who can issue that cast iron guarantee for the state pension is the Scottish Government. So they need to be clear in the campaign that everyone entitled to a state pension in Scotland will get in full, on time, what they are entitled to.
If we just think of the national insurance contribution as just another tax.
Well, it is just a tax, and personally, I would strongly suggest that the employer's national insurance element be removed entirely, because, I think as from April, we get employers like my small company. We're going to be paying, I think, 14.5% or something, maybe it's even 15% of the weight of people's wages as employers' national insurance contributions, which is on top of the 13.5% or 14% or something that the employee is going to be paying. So the employer national insurance contributions is just a tax on employment, and if you put a tax on something, you generally get less of it. That's why we put taxes on alcohol and cigarettes, is to reduce the amount that people use. So you put a tax on employment, you're going to get less jobs, and the wages will be lower for those who do get them. But there is another point here which I see some people have been raising in the chat. National insurance is just another tax. It's slightly different to other taxes because what you get depends slightly on how many years you've contributed. But the general narrative that tax pays for things is wrong, because it doesn't. The money starts off by being spent by the state, and state spending actually is what funds tax. So the state spends it first and then they tax it and take it back. The government can always buy whatever it wishes to buy because it just writes a cheque and spends it. There are no circumstances where the governor of the Bank of England would ring up the Chancellor and say, Mr. Chancellor, your account is overdrawn today, and unless you pay in funds by 4 p.m, I'm going to bounce the cheques. It just doesn't happen. It's actually illegal for the Bank of England to refuse a government payment. So they can, then the same thing would apply in Scotland, that the Scottish Reserve Bank will always pay any instruction that the finance minister gives it. So the only issue is about controlling the economy and how much you need to tax back to avoid inflation.
So how do you feel about that now? Do you think that it's fair for the UK government to have taken all our contributions over these years and not to have to pay us a pension? Are you convinced?
Well, I'm still stuck with that's not really fair. It's really kind of not fair, and then Scottish Government takes it on.
I liked one of the people contributing. I thought she had a great explanation for how she'd rationalised it in her mind, which was she thinks, well, I paid national insurance all those years, which then paid Scottish pensions to the pensioners of the day, which is actually true. That's how the pot works.
Yeah.
And now she's going to receive a pension from the contributions of people in Scotland. I like that way of thinking about it. It leaves you with a warm glow rather than a seething annoyance.
That's true. And I think you might just have convinced me there by reminding me of that bit of input from her. Yeah, it was very good, actually. It was very heartfelt, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Let's hope that the Scottish Government actually starts to think like that. I think the First Minister did mention pensions as being the subject of one of the papers they're going to be bringing out, over the next few months to help with the campaign.
We know that there's a series of papers yet to come out from the government, and I can't believe for a minute they're not going to do some proper research before they come out with those papers. But yes, it might be useful to do a follow-up session on this show. If you do know anybody who is wrestling with the question of how you answer this pensions question, show them this video, because it's a really, really good, not just the way Tim Rideout explains it, but I think what really makes it is the way you see the audience transform as the little light bulb goes on their head and they go, now I get it. I think.
Yeah.
You've been listening to The Indie Jigsaw Show, one of the Scottish Independence podcasts that the Indie Live podcast team produce. We bring you a podcast every week, often little extras as well, so subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts and you won't miss anything. Also, Indie Live Extra YouTube channel, because there's often little goodies there that we couldn't fit in the podcasts. If you want to get in touch with us, we're on indielivepodcasters@gmail.com or get us on Twitter at Scottish Indie Pod. Next week's podcast will be the July edition of Bits and Pieces. It's not as if there's any shortage of news, so join us for that, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks for listening. Bye now.